Good afternoon. I'm Aaron Brockmeyer. I am the City Network leader with Made to Flourish, and I'm so glad that you're able to join us for this afternoon's Zoom presentation with Sara Joy Proppe. Today we're engaging on the topic of more than avatars, the value of embodiment in a time of disorientation. So really glad to have so many people join us for this. My name, as I said earlier, is Aaron Brockmeyer. I serve as a senior pastor of Faith Baptist Church in North Minneapolis. I've been there for about 5 years. We're a 125-year-old Baptist church engaging in the community of North. And I also serve as a city network leader for Made to Flourish. Made to Flourish is a national pastors organization that seeks to integrate faith, work, and economic wisdom for the good of the community. Now, many of you are pastors, some of you are not pastors. This network is a national network helping people to bridge that gap that often occurs between Sunday and Monday, or put other ways to destroy the sacred secular divide. I was formerly an engineer. I experienced that personally, where serving in a local church, I got a lot of accolades for working with youth, teaching, but no one ever engaged or affirmed me in my work as an engineer, that separating of a Monday and a Sunday. But as I've grown through Made to Flourish and served as a pastor, my hope is that I affirm that there is no sacred secular divide, that there is no hierarchy of jobs in the kingdom, but that all our work is, when we work for the Lord, is good work and is valuable contribution to the kingdom. And so as a pastors network, we seek to come alongside pastors, church leaders, and congregations to be able to equip them for discipleship at work. And when people recognize that God is at work on Sunday and Monday, and that the assets of the congregation, they begin to engage with the community in a greater way as well. And that's where the community and economic wisdom comes into play. To give you a kind of an overview of how we engage, through books, we provide a number of different resources through webinars like this, through written material, through in-person presentations. But these are some of the resources. So this is one of the books that we provide. It's called For an Integrated Life, talking about that whole life discipleship, or destroying that sacred secular divide. Another sample that if you engage with the network, you'd be familiar with, or you can get through the network, is Work Matters. That's by our President Tom Nelson. Again, affirming the engagement with the Monday work, that God has created us to work, that he's involved in our work, and that our work is not just on a Sunday morning or as missionaries, but the janitor, the street sweeper, the architect, the urban planner, all those works are good works that God is involved in and contribute to the kingdom. And then I talked about the economics and the community engagement. This is Tom's newest book, Economics and Neighborly Love, how we engage in the work of the community. And that's, I think, why I'm excited to have Sara Joy a part of this. I think she does a fantastic job just bringing our awareness of our local place in the community and the role of the church and the congregants in loving our neighbor. And the last book I'm going to highlight is called Fertile Ground, Faith and Work for Youth Pastors. So we have lots of different avenues of integrating faith, work, and economic wisdom. Again, Sara Joy is going to talk about the placemaking aspect. Nathan Miller, who's a City Network leader with me, wrote a chapter in this book on how youth pastors can better be equipped to help their students thrive in college and in their careers, wherever God would call them. So I just wanted to give a second for Nathan to introduce himself.
Greetings. My name is Nathan Miller. I'm a City Network leader along with Aaron, serving here in the Twin Cities, but also a pastor. The whole network is led by pastors, by ministry leaders. And so really excited to have some of my team. I'm a pastor at Friendship Church in the Southwest Metro here, Shakopee and Prior Lake area. So really excited to have a group from our team joining the discussion today. Really excited to hear what Sara Joy has to share.
Well, again, we're so glad to have you all engaged. I'd encourage you to continue to be engaged. If you're not a member of the network, pastor or not, there are opportunities to receive resources, to find out about other events that we have going on in the city. We've had a great time this fall doing in-person and virtual events. We've been tying them together. So Sara Joy will actually be doing an in-person next week at the same time at the green space outside my church. We have a number of local treats from neighbor or local businesses, and we're going to encourage people to bring a lawn chair or a blanket and engage with part two here at my church outside. So let me introduce our presenter today. Her name is Sara Joy Proppe. She is become a dear friend of Nathan and myself and Made to Flourish. She works with the Proximity Project, doing consulting. She comes out of a background of urban planning and architecture. She's full of creativity and ideas. Recently, I've been enjoying listening to Sara Joy on the Embedded Church podcast. It's a podcast aimed towards churches to be able to recognize how their local neighborhoods, how they can walk and engage with their local neighborhoods to learn more about loving their neighbors, and engaging with the businesses nearby in different ways to really see, hear, listen, and engage with the local community. So a fascinating listen. Encourage you all to take some moments and download that podcast. It's 3 seasons now, isn't it, Sara Joy? The third season just launched, and I loved it. I always come out across after listening to an episode with new ideas, and just invigorated on the value of what it looks like to truly love our neighbors and creative ideas to do that, especially in such a time like this. So I'm excited because I know I'm going to come out of this presentation with lots of ideas and enthusiasm. But in order to do that, I need to hand it over to Sara Joy. So Sara Joy, I'm going to stop screen sharing and let you take over. And
I have an ambulance coming down my alley right now. Urban living at its finest. So, here we go. Okay, did I succeed?
You're good to go.
Good, and everybody can hear me. We're
Yep.
Good. All right. Well, thank you so much for everyone taking time out of your day to sit in on this for a few minutes, and thank you to Made to Flourish for hosting me. It's always a joy to work with your team and be able to share some of the things that I'm passionate about, and hopefully inspire some other people to be passionate about these things as well. And I recognize that it's kind of ironic that I am talking about embodiment over Zoom, but that is the reality of our life right now, right? But a little bit more about Proximity Project. I formed this organization really to educate and activate churches to leverage their property as assets to serve the local community. And really, I like to think about this is just creating opportunities for you to do ministry in very new and creative ways. I come from an urban planning and real estate development background, so I'm constantly thinking about property and how it influences the lives of people. And so I really started to see that there was a very distinct opportunity for churches to be creatively using their properties in this regard, and connecting with their neighborhoods in dynamic ways. And so that's my hope with the work that I do, that I can help churches do that well. So let's go ahead and get started in today's presentation. So when COVID quarantine happened, I had a good friend who asked me who my quarantine buddy would be. And I had to think about this for a few days, but I came back to her and I said, I think C.S. Lewis, actually. And my reason for C.S. Lewis was like, he'd be really great at sharing some very imaginative stories. He'd also be really great for some deep theological discussions. And I think he'd be really great for a stiff drink on those days that COVID just starts to feel really unbearable. So I decided C.S. Lewis was who I wanted to go with. And as I started getting ready for this talk, he just really came back to mind, and wanted to share a bit with you about one of his writings. And I think C.S. Lewis in particular is so profound at his ability to really capture the fragility and the beauty of the human condition. And I've just really appreciated that consistently in his writings. So today I wanted to start my discussion with one of my favorite books. Maybe it was one of his favorites, I don't know. But it's The Great Divorce. And if you haven't read this book, I really do highly recommend it. The story is told by a narrator who's beginning his journey on a bus in hell. And as the story begins, the narrator is asking questions of his seatmate, trying to understand the lay of the land in hell, if you will. And what's particularly fascinating to me in the way that C.S. Lewis writes this scene is that the way the seatmate describes hell to the narrator is not in terms of fire and chaos and kind of the typical ways that I think many of us have imagined it to be. But he really describes it in terms of social isolation and disconnection and disembodiment. So I'm going to read just a short excerpt for you from that. So this is the seatmate of the narrator describing hell. He says, "What's the trouble about this place? Not that people are quarrelsome. That's only human nature and was always the same even on earth. The trouble is they have no needs. You get everything you want, not very good quality, of course, by just imagining it. That's why it never costs any trouble to move to another street or build another house. In other words, there's no proper economic basis for any community life. If they needed real shops, chaps would have to stay near where the real shops were. If they needed real houses, they'd have to stay near where builders were. It's scarcity that enables a society to exist. If I can come back with some real commodities, anything at all that you could really bite or drink or sit on, why at once you'd get a demand down in our town. I'd start a little business. I'd have something to sell. You'd soon get people coming to live near. Centralization. 2 fully inhabited streets would accommodate the people that are now spread over 1 million square miles of empty streets." And so what I love about this passage is I think it just reflects so beautifully that tangible places and tangible needs are what make a community. That is really what brings people together. And I fully believe that we are created in the image of God, and connection to place and embodiment is really part of that being created in his image. So I'm going to unpack that a little bit for you today and then talk about what that means in terms of ministering in that regard. So first question, and feel free just to, I think, Aaron, do they unmute themselves or what do they do? Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
Not a
I was
hard
trying
question.
to unmute myself here.
Okay.
Yeah, if people want to engage, just go ahead and unmute themselves.
Okay.
And then please try to make sure to mute yourself when you're done talking.
But I just love to hear from you all. Not a hard question, but like, what are some of the places that you have missed during this time of COVID? Are there particular places that you've found yourself missing?
I miss going to my office and
Yeah.
just with the people that are there, and it's downtown, and the energy and the life that takes
Right.
place there.
Yeah, so much energy that being in an office provides.
I miss the coffee shops. We're relegated to the patios now, or curbside service.
Right. Yeah. I work from home, and so I miss the coffee shops too, because I don't have that space to go work outside and kind of be part of that rhythm of people. Anyone else? All right. Well, I'm sure that all of you all who did not chime in have places that you've missed. And I think what this shows us really is that we are a placed people, right? We are designed to live and to thrive in places. And we see that very explicitly right out of the gate in Genesis 2. And we have God planted the garden, and he put man in that place, that man who he had formed. And I love too, even in that passage, that it takes the time to say, like, in the east, like it gives us a direction, it like orients us a bit. And I think that that's another important component to recognize, is that being in a particular place is a way that we are oriented as well. And I think it's helpful too to create a distinction between space and place, and the fact that we are a placed people. And I would make the distinction in the sense that space becomes a place as a story is told, right? And so you think about, for example, a college dorm room. It's really just kind of a blank space, but it's once that new student moves in and they put up their posters, they put out their bedspread, start putting up their pictures, that it becomes a place, because suddenly there's a story that you see. There's somebody who has a life, who has values, who has relationships and things, and you start to get a better sense of who they are. It's same thing with a baseball field, for example. It's really just a field, it's a space, but then as you start to lay down those boundaries and put in baselines and a backstop and you play a game, suddenly it becomes much more of a place, because there's a cultural understanding and a shared meaning of what is happening and the rules of the game. And, and it becomes almost iconic. It's the great American pastime, right? Because it's become that important. And many of these places are really important to us in our culture. And so thinking about too, the Bible is a story of embodiment, right? It's a story of a place of things coming to shape. And I think what I love to think about too is the fact that, we have the earth without form is void. And so it was a space, but then God comes in and he starts to create particulars, and he creates a place, and then he creates Adam and he creates embodiment. And so then a story begins to be told. And I think that's just a beautiful thing to reflect on. And repeatedly too, throughout the Bible, we encounter promises of people inheriting the land. And we see that place is something that matters very deeply in our story, right? And that is places that really, they connect us to creation, they connect us to one another. And ultimately, too, by place is how we are oriented in that relationship to God and to one another as well. And so, and then we even see, too, I love this, Jesus, he comes to earth and to a city called Nazareth, and he's Jesus of Nazareth. And it's so that he would be called a Nazarene. So again, there's a lot of specificity to that, that he is a placed being in that. And two, what's interesting, I think, is that as followers of Jesus, we hold that tension, right, of being an embodied people in a particular place, but also within this larger narrative, this universal redemption narrative. And so we kind of hold these two tensions together. And I think that that really sets the stage for us understanding our embodiment in a far deeper way. This quote by Leonard Jarmelson, which you have at the bottom of the screen there, I think is just beautiful. He says, to hold to a view of the world where God becomes flesh is to acknowledge that God loves places. He loves the particular. And I would say that in order to really understand a deep soteriology, we have to have a deep anthropology. We have to understand what it means to be an embodied people. So moving on to my next slide here, I would say that we are embodied from, in, and for a place. And again, we're going to reflect on scripture here. I know most of you all are pastors, so you probably know all this stuff that hopefully can shed some new light on some of these ideas or reinvigorate some ideas around this. So as embodied people, we are made in the image of God, and we see God's creativity in this too. So again, in Genesis 2, we have that God actually formed man of the dust of the ground. So we're actually from a place. And I think that that's a very creative picture first, that like God would create us of the dust. And also too, I think that there's a real beauty in that, and showing just our dependency on God in that we are frail creatures in that regard as well. And we have later in the scripture that God says, we have scriptures that says he knows our frame and he remembers that we are dust. And there's just a real gentleness in the midst of that too, that I really appreciate. And so being from a place, and then we are in a place, right? Not only are we created out of the ground, so are the trees, and so are, you know, the things that we eat, and all of life is teeming kind of from the ground. And so we're embedded in a place in this natural world, and we're part of a rhythm. And so I think that that's a really important thing to remember, that God designed all of creation to work in synergy together, and us as embodied people are part of that. And then, and to be in relationship with one another as well. And then lastly, we are embodied for a place. And so this really comes into play with Genesis 1 and other passages throughout Genesis of really that call then to be fruitful and multiply. And I've loved just thinking over the years about what that means to be creating beauty, to create order, to create economies and connections and all of those things in our place, that we have been given that call, and that's part of that beauty of being embodied people. Unfortunately, we have not, we've disconnected ourselves from our place. And we see that with really the fall of humanity. And we've entered into a story of displacement and disconnection. And we're living in a place of exile. And so, and we see that very clearly in the beginning of Genesis. Again, here Adam and Eve have just sinned, and God comes to walk with them. And he asks them, and this is, I love this, this is the first question that God asks of mankind. He asks, "Where are you?" And I don't believe that in that moment, God really was like, "Oh, I'm confused. Where are y'all?" I think it was a question more asking man to orient himself. And what Adam and Eve don't know at this point is that they have entered into exile. They have entered into that disconnection, and they're unaware fully of that. But that's where God asks, you know, them to orient themselves. And from this point on, they will be, and we will be, in a place of looking for a return home, a return out of that exile, a return out of that displacement, and journeying to really a place of full shalom. Leonard Johnson, who I quoted earlier, also writes, which I think is wonderful. He says, "Shalom is more than the absence of conflict. Shalom is a wholeness and prosperity, peace and justice, a community that is thriving in relationship to the Creator and to the land." And I think that that's a really important distinction that he makes too, that again, that thriving in relationship to the land, that is a big part of who we are and how we build our relationships with Jesus and with one another. And I think what's interesting too is actually when we encounter displacement or disconnection or disorientation, there's a lot of shame and vulnerability that comes with that, and particularly in our broken places. And I think that the story in Nehemiah really paints a picture of that, in terms of, you know, Nehemiah is trying to find out, you know, how is Jerusalem doing? How is the remnant that is there? What is the city like for these people who have survived the exile? And the response we see is that they write, "The remnant there in the province who had survived the exile, is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire." And I think what's so interesting here is that there's literally an equating the brokenness of the city with the shame of the people. And I think about this in terms of modern day, how we struggle with that same element. If you think about people who grow up on the wrong side of the tracks, or who grew up in places that are just very broken, and the shame that is so easily associated with that, and the vulnerability that that brings to people as well. So again, I think that's a real thing for us to think about, and to recognize that the quality of our places really does have an effect on who we are as people, and how do we care for that. And the reality is, we have built our cities for many years with this kind of almost displacement and disorientation way of doing things. I'm going to put a slide up here, but I would say that we, by way of building, have really disoriented ourselves and disconnected ourselves from our places and from others. So you look at a slide like this and you can't place where you are, right? You're in probably any town, America. And the reality is that we really have built our cities in a manner that has given priority to convenience, consumerism, and cars rather than people and relationships. And we're now seeing all the effects of that in terms of just the social, physical, and mental health problems that we're facing in regards to heart disease and obesity and segregation and loneliness. These things are skyrocketing, and a lot of it is because we have designed ourselves into disconnection and disembodiment. And I would say too, and this is not news to anybody, our country is incredibly polarized, and we have forgotten how to practice civic virtue, how to have civil discourse, and we need to go back to having ways to invite people to interact, to know one another, to offer that grace and kindness for us to maneuver our world together, to be in relationship with one another, and to tell stories. And so I think, seeking the welfare of our city just has to include building and designing places that really speak to, reflect, and value human dignity. I would also add that not only are we living with this and how we navigate some of the disconnection by the way we've designed things, but now on top of it, we have the pandemic life, right? And this has added a whole nother layer to that disorientation. We feel disembodied by Zoom. We are removed from so many of the places that did give us some sort of rhythm to our lives, that made us part of a community in one way or another. And I would say churches are really starting to ask, how do we maintain a physical presence in our neighborhood or with our members? And how do we maintain a physical presence with our buildings? And is there even value in this? I think that's a question that keeps coming up, is well, maybe we just all get rid of all of our property. But I would say, no, there is value in maintaining that physical presence. And I think this is what stands out to me biblically, is that in these places of disorientation is really where we find that God has a very tender response to care for the embodiment in very particular ways. And for example, we have in Genesis 3, again, here we have Adam and Eve in a very vulnerable, displaced place. And God responds by creating clothing for them to cover up the shame and to care for their bodies in that regard. In Deuteronomy, and y'all, this is might be super weird, but this is seriously one of my favorite Bible verses because it's so small, but to me it's so meaningful. That here the Israelites have been wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And God says, your clothes have not worn out on you, and your sandals have not worn off your feet. It is so small, yet that is so significant. Because can you imagine wandering for 40 years and what that would do to your shoes? But yet God is that particular of a God, and he cares that much about our embodiment that he made sure their shoes did not wear out on them. And I started COVID with a pair of really old tennis shoes that I'd had probably for 10 years. And after 2 weeks of walking my neighborhood constantly, I was like, oh my gosh, I got to spend some money and get new tennis shoes. And I was just well, I need God in that, Israelite sandals, what I need. But anyways, I just think it's such a beautiful picture. And then the Israelites' response in that too is they set cairns and markers and altars to create places where they have seen God be faithful to them. And so even in the midst of being very disoriented and displaced, they are actively working to create places that they can point to the faithfulness and goodness of God. And I think that that's really cool to see. And then in the New Testament, we have really, we find that being in relationship to Jesus coincides with being in relationship to those around us, right? And particularly to those in our communities who have needs. So again, we have this verse of, I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. And then the last component there, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. And I think that that's particularly poignant in terms of welcoming those who are not of a place, right? They're the stranger, but welcoming them in and providing them a place to belong. I think that that's really valuable to consider then how we as followers of Jesus do that and reflect that in the way that we care for the embodiment of people. So this leads me to talking about what I call redemptive placemaking. And really, this is a call for us to be involved in making places. We're embodied creatures. We have physical senses, sight, taste, touch, smell, hearing. These are gifts that God has given us to really enjoy and have a rich and full experience here on earth. And our physical world has incredible power to promote or detract from people's flourishing as physical creatures. So, and I really believe that as Christians, we're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus on the ground in our communities, to love our neighbors, to promote human flourishing, and to really see our place and our embodiment as gifts. And I think we really can be, and I think as the church, particularly, as we see those things as gifts, then we can really reorient ourselves to share rather than to preserve. And I think that that's part of my challenge to you all today, is to think, if I have this property or this space, how do I share this in a way that it might feel kind of risky? At the same time, I think that it's a gift you've been given, and as embodied people, how do you extend that gift to the world around you? So I believe we're called to be placemakers, and we're ministering in a time of disorientation. And I think that the COVID pandemic is really an opportunity for many of us to reconsider how we're using our places and to encourage some of these connections to be made with our neighbors and our community. I'm going to read this quote from Ross Hastings. I think it's wonderful. "Mission is not the saving of disembodied souls out of creation, but participation with God in the redeeming of the whole persons to become fully alive in creation." And I have a picture here. I don't know how well y'all can see on your end, but this is a church near me who put up this sign probably a couple months ago or so and said, we're going to call this the St. Clement's Green, and you're invited to play, pray, read, what else does it say? Meditate, walk here in this space. And so I think, that's a super simple thing. And I think that cost them all of 10 cents to print out that paper and put it on their sign. But something as simple as that is really, I think, a valuable sign to your local neighborhood of, hey, we care, and we care about you as a human being, and creating a place for you to thrive and to be outside your apartment. So we're going to talk a little bit more about placemaking. What is placemaking? So there's an organization, Project for Public Spaces. They're a great group of people who have a lot of creative ideas. Check out their website. But really, it's coming together to reimagine your neighborhood, your city, your region, and really reinvent public space kind of at the heart of the community. And they say strength between people that they share, collaborate in shaping the public realm in order to maximize shared value. And I think we've already seen a lot of that happening naturally during COVID, as people have been out in public more and just shaping the public realm to better serve the needs of the community and have artistic expression and all of these things. So I think that's been really exciting to watch. So how do you play a role? How do you be active in that as well? And really, placemaking values and capitalizes on the physical, cultural, and social identities that define a place. They also have a quote that I really like that says, "Culture is born out of human interaction. It therefore cannot exist without people around to enjoy, evaluate, remix, and participate in it." And what I love about that is they're talking about culture being born out of human interaction. And I think that that just aligns so well with us as Christians being called with our cultural mandate, right? We're called to create culture. So we're called to be creating places where people can interact and can enjoy and all of that. So I think that churches have a significant opportunity with their property to dig into this work. I'm going to share some slides and ideas that can hopefully get some creative juices flowing for you in this regard. So this is what I call my 5 easy placemaking ideas. So I'll walk you through kind of each one of these. The thresholds is there's a lot of research that's done kind of around urban design and the human psyche of it's really hard for us as human beings to walk like straight from the exterior of a space to the interior of a space. It can feel really abrupt. And I would say particularly for people who are coming to church who may not be active churchgoers or have not been in a church for a while. And even me, somebody who goes to church regularly, I get really nervous when I go to new churches, particularly because I don't know the rhythms of the church and I don't necessarily know the people. So you're always a little like, ooh, what am I going to see on the other side of that door? And so one of the things that's really great to do is to have different things that kind of like warm people up to this space. And so thresholds do that in a interesting way of, is there a way to create things along the way to that front door that really help kind of bring people slowly into the interior rather than it being that abrupt transition. I also tell people I like to think of it as like the sidewalk sale for your church. So when you think about like you're shopping along the street and there's maybe a store that you come across that you like weren't planning on going into, but they've got a sidewalk sale going on. So then you're like, like maybe I'll stop and browse a bit. And then suddenly you're like, well, maybe I'll go inside and see what's on the inside, right? Because it slowly draws you in. And so thinking about that in terms of like, how do you have a sidewalk sale for your church? Like, how do you have activities and life happening outside that really sparks that curiosity and brings people into like talking to you and wanting to know a little more. And so part of that too is done through activities. So adding games or just ways that people can interact really helps break that ice. I give the example that, you know, you could put 2 strangers at a bus stop and with nothing to do and they won't converse and it'll be awkward. They'll sit and stare at their phone and do everything they can to not engage with one another. But you put those same 2 strangers at a bus stop and put like some weird out of place thing or a random piece of art, and the likelihood that they'll talk to each other goes up like exponentially because suddenly there's something like outside of them that they can focus on together and converse around, and that like totally breaks the ice. So I say, you know, have things like that can like help be distractions. That's actually like why dogs are such a great thing too, or like babies. So maybe you could just buy a dog or have a baby. But again, it gives people something to talk about like outside of themselves, and suddenly it like breaks the ice a lot easier. Then in terms of beauty, I would say, you know, just beauty is who God is. And so how do you cultivate that, whether it be through public art or gardens or just various things, but find ways to express that. I lived in Peru for a year, and the church that I worked with down there, they had a church located in one of the poorer neighborhoods. And they put a lot of money into just this really beautiful church structure and this beautiful garden, and it was very expensive. And there was criticism sometimes of, well, why do you put so much money into these things when, you know, there's like medical needs and all these other things. And they had medical facilities and things like that. But people thought, oh, more money should be going into that rather than these gardens and stuff like that. And I just loved their response because they said, you know, the people in these communities, their access to beauty is so minimal. And so we want to create a place where they have beauty and they can like understand that they are worth that dignity of like enjoying beauty. And I thought that was such a great testimony of really who God is in so many ways. And then wayfinding. This is so important, y'all, and like so easily overlooked and so simple. Some churches have a lot of stuff already going on, and they're just like really bad at communicating that it's available and open for people to use. So if you have stuff already in place, or if you put stuff in place, just really think about how do you make sure that people know that they are free to use it and engage with what you have going on. So real simple thing, but easily overlooked. So don't assume people know. And then lastly, places to rest. Again, God is a God of rest as well. And so how do you invite people to really, as embodied people, recognize we need rest and places of respite and quiet and beauty. And so how can you add some places and opportunities like that on your property? So those are kind of some of the 5, what I think are quick, easy, basic ideas for you to think about. Here's a few others. I won't go through all of these, but it could be that you already have a playground on your property. So what does it look like to open that up to the public, or to at least communicate that it's open to the public as well? Also, I always encourage churches that have parking lots to say, host a food truck on your parking lot one Saturday afternoon and invite the neighbors to come and enjoy a lunch free of charge. And that's a great way also to support a local business. So how do you think just through some creative things like that? I would also say, we are in the middle of COVID pandemic. So my disclaimer is abide by your social distancing guidelines and how that plays out in your own community. Be aware of those things. And then 2, I would say churches always come to me with liability concerns. And that's something that I've explored with different insurance agents, and a lot of times the response is, insurance policies for churches are already so robust because you're welcoming the public into your building every week. So any need to have more coverage for these types of things is usually pretty minimal, if not even necessary. But I always encourage people to double check. Don't take my word for it. I'm not an insurance agent. But also too, I would challenge you to remember that I do fully believe that Jesus calls us to be generous risk takers. So don't let the risk keep you from endeavoring some of these things. I think that there are ways to do these things well. So those are some ideas for you to consider. Also, sometimes it can be just as simple as taking what you're doing inside outside. So this is an example of Colonial Church in Edina, Minnesota. We worked with them a few years ago. And what was so funny to me is they had this great stormwater pond on their property, and they were doing all this native plant restoration and keeping bees. And it was very impressive, the things that they had going on. And then I went and visited one Sunday too, and they had this in the lobby, they had this plant bouquet kind of display, and it was oh, this is what's blooming in our pond right now. And I was like, why was this sitting in the lobby inside? I was shouldn't this be out by the pond? And where people, because there's a fair number of people who walk by their property, and they're oh, well, maybe that's a good idea. So then we kind of started brainstorming about okay, well, let's engage people outside. And we came up with this plan to put in a walking path, and that highlighted the different things that they had already going on in their property and just made it much more publicly available and sharing the knowledge. And so then it was really fun. We invited a congregation. We put in this temporary path, invited the congregation one Sunday after church to walk the path and learn more about the different initiatives that they had going on. Unfortunately, you see that picture down on the bottom. It snowed. It was October 4th. Who would have thought it would snow? But it did. But we did this walking path, and it was so great because the congregation came back, and so many of the people just were oh, I learned so much more about what we're doing as a church, and I feel more inclined to actually be on the property and participate in some of these things. And then too, in the process, we worked with the neighborhood association next door and just said, hey, we're looking at putting in this walking path. And they were super excited and was oh, that sounds like a great plan. We'd love that. And then they're oh, there's this creek that we share between our 2 properties that we would love to apply for a watershed cleanup grant. Do you think y'all would be able to work with us on that? And so, it started sparking conversations with them working with this neighborhood association next door to clean up the creek next door that they both share. And I think, really it was just a again, a great picture of how that like opens doors to relationships that weren't there. And that became very natural for them to think about ways to work together because of this care for this creek that is part of the place where both of them are as people. And so it was a fun project to see and take shape. So I got to talk about the church parking lot too. Let's all admit, this is like the ugly need of like almost every church, right? It's like the eyesore of your property, but then if you got rid of it, like your congregation might pitchfork you. So I recognize that you live in a tough space with that. If I had my way in a perfect world, I'd get rid of every church parking lot. But I realize that is not necessarily a good approach either. But what are some ways that you can use it creatively? I think that you can find ways to bring some of these things together. So, you know, is there an opportunity to paint some basketball courts or for some Foursquare courts on your parking lot so that people during the week can use them, have a bike rodeo a couple of times in the summer that helps kids learn how to ride their bikes better, host farmers markets, things like that. You know, everybody talks about winter's coming in Minnesota, which is true. I'm from Texas. I've seen y'all. Like, Minnesotans are pretty hardy. I've been impressed at like how much happens during the winter. So I think you can still do some very creative things even in the winter. Thinking about, you know, do you have a couple of bonfires and roasting marshmallows and invite the local fire department to come and participate and be there as security, but also as just part of like community gathering. Can you do some sort of like winter market where some local artisans can sell some of their things and you have hot chocolate available and it's a little pop-up space that people can use. So I think there's still some creative things, even in winter. And two, I want to tell the story of a church that in South Minneapolis that has, they're more of an urban church, so their parking lot was very small, but they did have a small parking lot. And one of the things that was interesting, they were talking to me one time, they were saying, oh, we have this Somali man in our neighborhood who has started using our parking lot during the week as kind of a place for him to like do maintenance work on his car. And he started out doing that, and then it kind of started to grow. Like, he had friends bring their cars, and then there was like more car maintenance, you know. And it was an interesting thing of and they were kind of in this tension of like, you know, this is really great because we're glad it's getting used during the week, but then like, is this going to turn into like, there's like this whole like car shop happening on our parking lot that we can't control, you know? And I was like, well, you know, why don't you think of ways to like grow that relationship so that it's more of kind of a partnership? And I think then that allows you to have some better like way to manage that, right? And so I was like, well, do you have young people in your congregation and maybe even older people who would need some guidance on how to change a tire, how to change your oil, things like that? I was like, maybe you could strike up some sort of partnership with him that he could help teach some of these young people in your congregation some of these skills. And then there again, now you're kind of creating this partnership, and there's much more of a give and take, and it doesn't become this like turf war sort of like element that can so easily erupt in those types of situations. So again, too, just think creatively. If you have, you know, opportunities like that, what are those partnerships that you can really like dig into? Oh, and then too, so this is much larger scale, but this is happening more and more as churches who are maybe losing some congregational capacity and realizing they have parking lots that, you know, they don't need that full parking lot anymore. And so we see, particularly in California, this is happening a lot, but there are churches that are starting to either lease their land or work with a developer to potentially even sell off a portion of their land for affordable housing. And affordable housing is an incredible crisis in our country, everywhere, every city. It is so needed. And so I think that that's an area too where churches can really begin to think strategically and step in if you have excess land or excess parking lots, ways to consider that. There's also the tiny home movement is becoming stronger. And so what does it look like even, you know, is there a way for you to do some permitting for some tiny homes on your property? So there's some creative avenues to consider to address that crisis in our country as well. So if you have questions about that, you can reach out to me. I can give you some guidance, and I know some other people that are at that table too and really working on that. So where do we go from here? And I would just say, it starts small. I always tell people, start small, because if you think, oh, we need to go build affordable housing on our parking lot, that's going to feel too big. So walk. I mean, seriously, just put your feet into practice in your place. And I think that probably many of you already are doing this because of COVID. I know walking has become our national pastime in many ways. So continuing to do that. And I would really encourage you to not do that blindly, to really observe while you walk. So pay attention to those sidewalks, pay attention to the broken places in your neighborhood. Where do you see things that are empty, that are broken, that need enhancement? And how do you start beginning to dream, like, what could that look like? How could we invest in that and make that better? Also, too, I encourage people, when you take those walks, consider, if you're an able-bodied person, consider what it would be like to have a disability or a handicap and walk the same sidewalks with that mindset. You'll start to notice that there's a lot more that's not conducive for them than you would be aware of just walking yourself. Also, young kids, that's another good one too. And several of you probably have that, where pushing a stroller can be difficult and complicated. And, so suddenly being much more aware of what that looks like and how can you advocate for better sidewalks and places in your neighborhoods. What does that look like? I would say, listen. We can't say this enough, because I think we're always really bad at this, no matter how much we say it. But really do listen. Go to your neighborhood association meetings. Go to the local chamber of commerce. I mean, call your council member and say, hey, what do you need? I guarantee you that will be like a game changer, because they don't get people calling them, asking them that. They get people calling them, telling them what they need to do for them. So I think that right out of the gate will be just so valuable. Ask questions. What do people need? I like this picture a lot, because I think so often we start from the space of, like, what's wrong with your neighborhood? And it's like, oh, we're already starting from like a negative standpoint. That's great. So I think instead of starting there, say like, hey, what's really great here? Like, what's working well? And then like, what could be made better from what's already working well? It frames the conversation in a lot more positive of a way out of the gate. So think strategically in that regard. Partner with people. Find people who are doing good work already in the neighborhood and find out ways that you can piggyback with them, or say, hey, we've got this property, are there ways that, like, things that you need that would like make your organization or your business or whatever it is run better if you had some like extra space or something in some way, so ask those questions. And then I test run ideas. I always push this big time, because again, I think so often, I've had churches come to me that they're like, oh, we want to like redo our narthex or something. And so often they're like, well, we contacted this architecture firm and then they gave us this like $50,000 plan. And then what happens to that $50,000 plan? It gets shoved on the shelf almost immediately, because the church that feels too big of a bite, and suddenly they're defeated before they even start. And so I always say, hey, just test run some ideas, do things for really low price, see what works and what doesn't work. So a lot of these like exterior community engagement type ideas, a lot of people get freaked out and say, well, is that going to invite bad behavior? Or, what if people steal everything? Or these are a lot of the questions that come up. And those things might happen, but also there are a lot of what ifs. And I think we spend a lot of time getting caught in the what ifs. And that doesn't allow us to move forward. So I always say, test run something really small and start rooting that conversation in reality. And as you start to test things, and then you start to see, did those what ifs happen? And some might happen, but it allows you then to pivot and to readjust and to like come with a different approach. But then I think there's a lot of those what ifs that don't happen, and suddenly people are less fearful because those things didn't happen. So I always encourage people to invest at whatever amount of money that doesn't feel risky, right? So if it's like, I can invest $500, and if it like, none of it works, like nobody's gonna like be up in arms, versus like, I can like, oh, let's go invest $5,000 or $10,000 and it doesn't work. Well, you might get some people that are pretty angry and feel like you've just wasted a bunch of money. But using that $500 to, let's set out like some cheaper chairs and some flowers and just see what happens, right? And then as you start to get a better sense of what works and doesn't work, then you can make some of those larger investments down the road. So I think there's a lot of value in doing very small ideas just to test run things. So I think, oh yeah, I want to talk about this because I think this is really great. So asking questions is really, really valuable. And a church in San Antonio, First Baptist Church San Antonio, came to me with these questions several years ago. And I just am like, these are brilliant. So I've like used them repeatedly, but they are in a process of, they say they now like ask the nascent questions is what they call it. So it's really reorienting yourself instead of starting with, what kind of construction does our city regulations allow? It's what kind of space does our city need? How much parking does our church need? Well, how can we meet parking needs without creating an empty lot? How can 2 Sunday school classes and a weekday study best share one room? Who in the city could benefit from this space? How long before we run out of space? Well, how well do we know the venue schedulers and shopkeepers in this city? And I think that that's been an interesting thing that I've seen more and more, particularly with some urban churches. Aaron alluded to the podcast that I co-host, the Embedded Church, and there's been several pastors on that podcast that we've interviewed who talk about actually renting space for their Sunday school classes and things like that, rather than having it all self-contained in one building or feeling like they need to build additions, but being really creative about how they partner with others and finding space. And in the long run for them too, that's financially more sustainable so often, because then they're not carrying on the books the maintenance of space that doesn't get used throughout the week. So it works, it's positive for the city and it's positive for the church. So I think it's a really great partnership to consider if that's possible in places. So yeah, so those are some things to hopefully get you thinking creatively in this regard and appreciating the place that you have been given and the embodiment that you've been given, and how that really, how do you use that in a way that furthers the flourishing of your neighborhood. And so yeah, so I am here to help you. This is what I do. This is my passion. I go to a church property and my mind goes in like 5,000 directions of like, what are the opportunities? So I'd love to help people, assess your community and identify what are some of those creative opportunities, ways too that you can find more about me or get more in resources and things. You can sign up for the newsletter on the website. Also, I put together a Walk Your Block walking series earlier this year, and that's free for downloads. You can sign up. It's 6 walks. You'll get the email in your inbox each week with a new walk for 6 weeks. That, again, it just gives you kind of a framework to think more critically as you're on those walks about, how your neighborhood is designed and where you can play a role in the story potentially of a better neighborhood. And then listen to the Embedded Church podcast. There's some great examples just through the interviews that we do with pastors there. As there's some very creative pastors who are thinking very strategically about their place in the neighborhood. So I encourage you to give that a listen because it's encouraging to hear them. So that's all. I think it's time for question answer. I don't know how much time we have, but do I stop screen sharing too?
Yeah, let's do this. Let us.
I went super long.
No, you're good. I want to honor that 3 o'clock. So what we're going to do is let me just do a little bit of details, and then we will open back up for Q&A but I want to honor everybody's time who needs to leave about 3. So I wanted just to emphasize what Sara Joy's availability. She does consulting, and she will, from the easy steps to engaging in a bigger renovation to navigating city planning and working with community, all steps. So I've seen her interact and heard a number of people who have worked with her, and she does a fantastic job. So encourage you to reach out. I think you do like 30 minutes free, so you do that to begin with. Encourage you to engage with that. And are you available to preach on Sunday mornings too? That first part was excellent, Sara Joy. So you can reach out privately to Sara Joy to have her on a Sunday morning, but that introduction just so well done. Thank you, Sara Joy. We get to have the privilege of having Sara Joy back next week. Speaking of green spaces, I have a green space at my church in North Minneapolis. We're going to meet out there, the business a couple blocks away. Dancing Bear Chocolate is going to provide goodies, and Corner Coffee is going to provide hot drinks. So encourage you to come. It'll be, we'll physically distance appropriately, mask at your discretion, bring a lawn chair. We do ask that you register first. So there is information in the email that I'll follow up with. Please make sure to register if you can join us in person. And the next event that we have with Made to Flourish Twin Cities is actually a national event online. We're hoping to also have some local places gather and engage as a group in it. It's November 12th. It's called the Common Good Conference. We've had it. In fact, that's where we first met, connected with Sara Joy. She was a speaker at our 2017 Common Good here in the Twin Cities. But we are all virtual this year. But that's a great way to engage in some more ways to seek to love and serve your neighbors and to integrate faith, work, and economic wisdom. Nate and I are available for interaction or questions. Encourage you to join the network, pastor or not. Let's us tell you about events and resources that we have in the Twin Cities throughout the year. So always something going on, and we love being able to bless and to serve churches in that way.